We're going to go a little bit deeper into Donald Trump and his relationship with Israel and what is going on here with our next guest. Joining us now is Dr. Shael Ben Ephraim, former UCLA professor, diplomat, expert in military strategy, and host of the History of the Land of Israel podcast and the Israel Explained YouTube channel. He's been on the show several times before. He's had recently quite the transformation in his viewpoints. We're going to talk to him about that now. Shael, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure, always a pleasure.
You've had a major shift. I want to start off with the major shift that you've experienced in your own view of the war. We've had you on the show. I don't know, how many times have you been on? Maybe 3 other times before this, I think?
I think it was the 3rd time.
Okay. And each time you've gone through a slight evolution. The very first time we had you on the show, you were adamant that it wasn't a genocide. There was, that you are a Zionist, you're a proud Zionist, you love Israel, you live in the United States and in Israel. And we had a great conversation, but we had very different views on what was going on. The second time, you had a bit of a different shift. You started to feel like, yes, Israel is committing war crimes. And you'd gotten to the point of war crimes are happening. We need to speak up against these war crimes. This is bad. But recently, I've noticed from following you on X that you've had now a major shift where you now feel like it is a genocide that is actually going on against the Palestinians. What got you to this point?
Well, I think I've had a shift in how I'm evaluating the war, but I don't think I've had any shift in my values.
Okay.
I remain a Zionist, and I remain, as I was at the beginning of the war, very concerned about Palestinian human rights. What's happened over the time is just the amount of evidence that I've had from sources that I trust on the severity of what Israel is doing in Gaza, which led me to change my mind about the operation. A lot of it in real time due to escalation of Israeli policy rather than some sort of massive change in my value system. I think it's important to not point to any change in perception of this war as evidence of anti-Zionism, because that plays into a lot of ways that Israel tries to excuse its crimes. They try to say that anyone who is against this war, anyone who sees the immorality of what's happening in Gaza is anti-Zionist, and that anyone who is anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. And that way they can dismiss anyone who has problems with this war. It's a defensive mechanism. As soon as I came out and said that it's a genocide, a lot of people said, well, now he's turning against Israel, now he's turning against Zionism. But I haven't. I still think that Israel it needs to exist as a Jewish state. I still think Israel has the right to defend itself. I just don't think it has the right to commit genocide in order to defend itself. And I think that there's a significant amount of people who agree with me. I learned that when I came out and said what I said, that I represent, I don't know what the numbers are, but I represent a large amount of people who said, yeah, finally there's someone saying, I love Israel, I support Israel, but I don't support this, and this is genocide. Since Zionism is the belief that there should be a Jewish state, or at least a Jewish home in the land of Israel, that doesn't in any way mean that you have to excuse horrific things that Israel does in Gaza. There's no automatic link there, and I see it as a mission to sever that supposed link, and it would be good if other people helped, because that will help other people come out against the war. Ultimately, it's up to Zionists and Jews to stop this. And since anti-Zionist is kind of a slur that's often used against people, it's really better to look at who's an opponent of this genocide rather than say, oh, they're all anti-Zionists or they're all anti-Semites or so on and so forth. Now, as far as the evolution that I had in terms of my attitude towards the war, that was all based on empirical evidence, right? When the war started, I supported it fully, because after October 7th, if Israel hadn't reacted, the results would have been disastrous for the country in terms of security, in terms of deterrence, and of course you had to get the hostages back. But the war that developed was not the war that would have addressed those problems. It became very clear after just a few months that Netanyahu was running the war for his survival, and it became clear a few months later that the war crimes that had been committed from day one in the war were not so much a mistake and an aberration as much as a policy. And over the last few months, I've heard from sources in the IDF and other very informed sources that Israel is intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure, in some cases, civilian individuals, and has a plan to destroy the Palestinian people as an entity, which I think conforms to the definition of genocide. So it's just been a question of following what Israel is doing, and I think that it's very rare that people just follow the evidence, because if you go against your tribe, there are a lot of consequences to pay.
And you've experienced a lot of backlash from people. I mean, you say that you've experienced a lot of support. What has been the reaction? Has it been more support or less support and more backlash, would you say?
Well, I got a ton of backlash, but the vast majority of backlash that I got was from people who already deeply didn't like me, because I had been talking about what Israel's doing wrong in Gaza for many, many months. So, there were people who had already said some, very nasty things about me or had attacked me quite often, and then they escalated their attacks. And the absolute biggest Zionist accounts, some of which had not addressed me in any way, started to attack me as well. But none of that surprised me at all. I was completely prepared for that. As soon as I used the word genocide, I knew that would happen. I know that that's a taboo that they don't want broken, so that didn't surprise me. What surprised me is the amount of support that I got, especially from Israelis. I really wasn't expecting that. Some American Jews contacted me and said, "We agreed, and what you did is very brave," and that I was expecting. But a lot of Israelis contacted me and said, "You're putting into words things that we aren't ready to put into words yet, and you're absolutely correct." Others said, we've been saying this. A lot of Israelis agree with you, and they're being hushed. And I was just very surprised to see how many people agree, or at least how many people don't think that it's far-fetched. Basically, there's a taboo in saying this. If you say it, people get very angry. But the amount of people in Israel who know that what's going on in Gaza is completely unacceptable appears to be very high. And while I've been doing this, unrelated to me, but because there's something in the air in Israel, there's also been an expansion of anti-war demonstrations. Just a few weeks ago, people started demonstrating with pictures of Palestinian babies that had been killed in the war. It started off with like 10 people the first time I saw one of those demonstrations. Now I see hundreds of people in my hometown, Jerusalem, very conservative city. I see hundreds of people standing with pictures of Palestinian babies. There's definitely a growing constituency in Israel that believes this, and I've gotten a lot of support from people I did not expect.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about why you're still a Zionist, because I do think they're interlinked. I do think that the genocide is interlinked to Zionism. I don't think you can separate them. So first of all, because maybe you could separate it now. Maybe there's an ability at this juncture to say, okay, we can have, a Jewish state, and then we can have, the non-Jewish states surrounding the Jewish state, right? Which would maybe include Palestine, which would hopefully include that. And then, of course, there's the others. And so I think now you maybe could say, why not? And why do we have to then go and attack these other areas? We already have our Jewish area, so why do we need to attack the others? You could maybe make that argument, but the history of even getting the area that the Jews now have control over as a Jewish state required a very similar, if not worse, tactic than what's going on right now in Gaza.
No, I think that there was a very big difference between what happened in 1948 and between what's happening now. I am not a Nakba denier or someone who particularly justifies what Israel did in 47 and 48, but it was very different. At that time, the emerging, Jewish state was under immense threat of survival. The war in 1948 was started by Palestinian militias who were threatening the roads between Jewish settlements, who put a siege on Jerusalem. They were at the time starving the Jews in Jerusalem rather than what's happening now in Gaza. And every Jewish settlement that was taken over by Arab forces was slaughtered. Like, for example, what happened in Gush Etzion when the Arab Legion took it over. And Israel was also preparing for an invasion of all the Arab states that occurred in May 1948. So it had a strategy of removing the threat to the roads, which involved, clearing out, ethnic cleansing of Arab villages, and it committed all sorts of war crimes, like in Deir Yassin and Tantura and so on and so forth. But at that time, we were talking about a vicious war between two communities, both of which committed horrific war crimes, where it was unclear who the strongest one was, and both communities were trying to survive. Israel could have done a lot better than it did in terms of protecting Palestinian lives, and didn't. Palestinians could have done the same thing. And of course, we're talking about the 1940s, when the exchange of populations was very common. You look at the Germans that were driven out of Russia, you look at what happened with India and Pakistan, you look at what happened in Cyprus, so on and so forth. So the context was very different. Now we're talking about a situation where Israel is the powerful side, where there's really no threat to the existence of the state of Israel from Hamas, at least not anymore, probably not at any point. You have people who are at the mercy of Israel. Israel is not gaining anything in terms of its security. I'd say quite the opposite. By doing a lot of the things that it's doing, like destroying the clean water supplies, like bombing the hospital networks, all the things that it's doing. And it's planning an ethnic cleansing that's complete, not in order to get rid of a village here or a village there. After all, in 48, a lot of Arabs remained where they were because they weren't a threat. That's why there's so many Arabs in Israel. But the idea in Gaza is to get rid of every single Palestinian. That's increasingly what Israel is planning. So you have two differences between 1948 and today. One is that Israel's a lot stronger today, and second is that the attempt at the destruction of the Palestinian people is a lot more complete. So what you had then was an attempt to win the war, which involved crimes. Now you have an attempt to actually destroy the Palestinian people. Now, I think Israel, having said all that, I think Israel needs to make up for the Nakba. I think Israel needs to compensate the Palestinian people. I think that Israel needs to take complete responsibility for what it did in 1948. But I don't think that it's in any way the same thing. And I think that the Palestinians, if they had won that war, would have done the same, if not worse, to the Jews. And more importantly than all that, I don't believe in countries that exist in original sin. And I think that that's something that Israel's critics are very wrong about. I think that the fact that Germany committed the Holocaust doesn't mean that Germany shouldn't exist. And the fact that America genocided Native Americans doesn't mean that America shouldn't exist. And the fact that in 1948 and now Israel did things that it shouldn't do, and now I believe it's genocide as well, doesn't mean that Israel shouldn't exist. It does mean it needs to be reformed and changed in a very deep way. So does the United States, by the way, and Germany did that to some extent, could do more. So yeah, I think that Israel is a very flawed country like many other countries. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist, in my opinion.
Well, but when you go back to the 1940s, I mean, the fact is that war shouldn't have even happened at all, because there shouldn't have ever been an attempt to create a Jewish nation on land that was already occupied by a bunch of other people. I mean, the issue that led to that was for 50 years prior to that, for the 50 years leading up, or maybe even 70 years, there were a lot of Jewish immigrants showing up and having conversations about taking the land as a Jewish nation, rather than integrating in and assimilating in to the land and living there amongst the people who were already there. So it became highly threatening to have all of these outsiders showing up and saying, we want to create a Jewish nation. Well, what does that mean if you're not Jewish and you're sitting there on your land that you've lived on for hundreds of years with your family? That is, so when you go to the 40s, the fact is that there shouldn't have ever even been a war that needed to happen, because it really shouldn't have ever been this attempt to create a Jewish nation to begin with. I mean, that was the original sin. I get that. And I agree with you that at this juncture, we can't we can't go back and say, well, what happened in the past, so we have to rectify it or remedy it, and now these nations can't exist 100 years later or 200 years later or whatever it is. I agree with you on that. But the fact is that we as a nation here in the United States, we recognize our original sin, right? We all say what happened, the Trail of Tears. What we did to the natives was terrible, but we stopped short of, okay, we'll give them back the land, right? So I agree on that point, but the bottom line is that the concept of Zionism it is fundamentally about Jews having a nation, Jews having a home, which I am not against that concept as a bare concept, but do it somewhere where there are no people, and then carve out, homestead someplace, carve out, have land that's empty, and you homestead it, and you make that the Jewish nation. Fair enough, right? That's fine. People have been doing that forever, going and homesteading empty land. But this land wasn't empty. And so the concept of Zionism caused and required for all of these people to go somewhere else or to wage war on the people who were already there without really being, that in and of itself was the issue, don't you think?
It's not that simple. There's a lot of truth to what you're saying, but it's nowhere near that simple. If you look at the start of the Zionist movement in Palestine, the aim to have a state wasn't the stated aim of the movement. If you look at the Balfour Declaration, for example, it says a homeland for the Jewish people. It doesn't say that there will be a state necessarily. It says that whatever homeland Jews have will not infringe on the rights of the Palestinian people in any way. And Jews were willing, much more willing than the Palestinians were, to create joint institutions in the 1920s and the early 1930s with the Arab population. And the stated goal of the Zionist movement wasn't a state until the early 1940s. What happened in the interim was several violent attempts by Palestinian Arabs to dislodge the growing Jewish and Zionist presence in the land of Israel. Whether there were riots, the Nebi Musa riots in the early 20s, 1929 riots, the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, and several other incidents. A lot of those made the Zionists who were in Palestine much more militant than they had been before. When the first riots broke out, Jews didn't even really have military organizations. By the 1940s, they had some very strong military organizations, and including terrorist organizations. But a lot of that was a response to these riots that killed a lot of innocent women and children. And that's not to say that the Arabs, I don't understand why the Arabs reacted the way they did to Zionism. But, there's attempts by just about everyone who looks at the history of Zionism and Palestine to take one side and make it the victims and take one side and make it the good guys. And if you actually look at the events, it's just much more complicated. You have interplay. You have a Zionist movement that was talking a lot about coexistence early on. And you have certainly Palestinian Arabs who were also talking about coexistence early on. And then you have the extremists from both sides getting stronger as both sides got more aggressive. The British handled the situation quite badly. They certainly have a share in all this as well. And there's no saints and sinners here, And as far as the choosing the land of Israel as the place to do it, there have always been Jews in the land of Israel, and it has incredible historical significance. And it's more important to Judaism than it is to Islam. And there's really no inherent reason why that land can't be shared between Jews and Arabs. It could have been shared then if people had done a better job, and it could be shared now. So I don't see that there's anything inherently wrong with Jews living in Palestine.
Right.
And I think that both people deserve a nation. And anyway, even if you're right, and I believe that you're not, this is all a done deal. And Israel's not going to stop existing. Israel's not going to dismantle itself. And Jews and Arabs need to learn to live together, not to fantasize about replacing each other.
Sure. But the Zionism as a concept, it's one thing to say, well, we got to live together, that this is a homeland that the Jews feel, an affinity for and want to come back and live on it. And that's fine to a point. I mean, we don't allow free-for-all immigration into this country for a reason. And if you if you change out the players and you look at it from the perspective of, let's say, the United States, so we've had, we're a country of immigrants, we've allowed immigrants in. But if the immigrants show up and they start talking about, well, we're actually wanting to flood the zone with so many of us that we can then take control over the place, you're going to get backlash from the supposed natives, those of us who've lived here that, if suddenly a bunch of Chinese start flooding in to the United States, for example, and they start talking about, we're going to make this the new Shanghai and, and we're going to flood, we're going to encourage immigration, and they start encouraging it, and they start bringing in boatloads of people from China, and they're developing the new Shanghai, and they pass out flyers saying that we're developing the new Shanghai, and they get people all on board on this. That is going to trigger a backlash from the people who've been there the whole time. And I think in that situation, you absolutely can pick the bad side. And the bad side would be those that are trying to flood the region. Now, I agree with you. When you look back at the history, there's atrocities that have happened from both sides. Arabs absolutely committed atrocities against Jewish people. Jewish people committed atrocities against the Arabs. Like, that is absolute historical fact and atrocious that there was a lot of tit for tat, a lot of, back and forth, a lot of violence that happened. But I still side with, I think, those who are being invaded. That is the group that I think has more right to then to defend themselves. And, like October 7th, I think that, after October 7th, of course, the Israelis had a right at that point, more of a right to defend themselves. They got invaded and a horrible thing happened. Basically a terrorist attack happened onto the Israelis. So that puts them in the moral footing to say, we have the right to retaliate, or we have the right to fight back. We have the right to defend ourselves. Now, they went way too far with the genocide, and that's what we have agreed on. But you can say one side is more at fault for. Now, October 7th, that one gets a little slightly more complex because of the major history between the two groups. But if you just go back to the basic beginning, when you're talking about a group of people from Europe flooding in, I do think that the moral right stays with the people who are being invaded. And they have the right to want to do what they can to kick those people out. And we have that moral right, right now, what we're dealing with here in the United States with the border crisis, as we say, we have the right to be a sovereign nation. We have the right to not allow you to flood into this country. And we have the right to round you up and kick you out. And that's, you could call it driving them out of the area. You could look at it like that. Like, we could say all these Latin Americans are being driven out of North America. We could certainly frame it that way, or call it a genocide of the Latin American people that were rounding them up and shipping them back home. But nobody looks at it that way, because the moral right stands with those of us that are feeling like we're being invaded by people that are just flooding in through the borders. So, I hear you, but I still think that the Arabs were in the right to get upset and to want to fight back and to want to get rid of a bunch of people coming in.
Well, I don't agree with the example you're giving about the United States or with the original. So I'll stay away from the United States a little. Well, you know what? No, I'll use it to illustrate some of the complexity of the issue. So there was no invasion of Jews into Palestine. That's really not how it worked. Look at Palestine in the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was a Muslim majority in Palestine, but it was not all that large a majority. There were a lot of Jews living in Palestine. There were other people. There were Turks. There were Circassians. There were all kinds. And Jews were a majority in several areas. Jerusalem, Sfat, a few other areas. There weren't that many Muslim Arabs in Palestine. There were more than Jews, but there weren't that many. In the 20th century, for various reasons, the population increased. Both Jews and Arabs came to the country. A lot of it was opportunities that were created by the Jewish-led economy, by the British mandate, and so on and so forth. The Jews who came, the vast majority of them came legally and bought land from Arabs legally. They didn't have the ability to drive anyone off the land at the time. They didn't control the government. First, the Turks controlled the government, then the British controlled the government. They didn't have the arms to drive anyone off the land. They bought land. They came in fair and square and bought land. So did a lot of Arabs at that time. What we have is migration, not invasion. By the way, that stands for the United States as well. in the United States, you have people coming into places like Texas, New Mexico, etc., where it used to be part of, a Spanish empire, and it's a lot of Latinos lived there before white people came, and it's not some kind of invasion of foreigners in that case either. It's a much more complicated case here. A lot of them came legally. They're not all coming illegally. So it's actually quite similar. You have two people with strong roots in the area, right? Mexicans have strong roots in the area, and Jews have strong roots in the area, and Arabs have strong roots in the area. And it wasn't an invasion; it was migration, and that's true for Palestinians as well. And what we do is we create these very stark narratives of good and bad, invaders, natives versus settlers, and so on and so forth, because it's convenient for political narratives. But in reality, we're talking about people, and we're talking about people who in many cases have lived there for generations, and in some cases people who want a better future in that place, and that's okay as well. These are very simplified narratives in both cases. There wasn't an invasion of Jews into Palestine at any point in the way that you're putting it. There was migration, there was buying land, and even when Israel brought a lot of immigrants in, they weren't all from Europe. In fact, more of them, after Israel was created, came from Arab countries, and that's because they were ethnically cleansed from their countries, where they'd lived for many generations as well. So it's just a lot more complicated than you're putting it. And I advise everyone to look at Palestinians and Jews as people and individuals with wants and needs and homes, and not as abstract groups of good and evil.
The problem is Zionism, though. I mean, it's one thing with, the example that you use with Mexican, this definitely was part of the Spanish Empire. There was, California and Arizona and all these areas were Mexico. And then the United States gained control after a war. Sure. But what we're not seeing, the biggest difference is that we're not seeing a bunch of these Mexican Americans, or even the Mexicans or the Latinos that have come in to the United States, claiming they want to create a new Mexico, a new Latin America, and a homeland just for them, that is for them, where they are in charge, where it's their land, their right. We're not seeing a movement where people are saying, this is our ancestral homeland and we're taking it back, or this is where we want to be and we're going to control it and it's ours. And there's plenty of other place for you people to go. You have the rest of the United States. We're only talking about 1/3 of the land. You guys can have the other 2/3. Like, get out of here. We're not seeing that. And so that's the biggest difference. Zionism creates this mentality of, we want to create a Jewish homeland, and that means no Jews allowed, no non-Jews allowed, or very, very few of you, because you can't have any sort of majority or any sort of, voting rights, or, we got to keep it at about 20%. So that's the biggest, the big difference. The crux of the issue is Zionism. And I guess that's why I'm bringing up Zionism, and I'm confused as to how you could still be a Zionist, because that is the fundamental mentality that has led to all of the conflict.
No, I disagree. I see the conflict as two nationalist movements clashing, and just as well as you could say this is all about Zionism, you could say this is all about Palestinian nationalism as well, right? You have Palestinian nationalism emerged as an antithesis to Zionism, but you already had nationalism in other Arab countries, especially in Syria, from before. And that Arab nationalism meant that they were very unlikely to accept other nations. And that's one of the major reasons that we had all of those attacks against the Jewish community, starting in the 1920s, but also there was violence against Jews before. The truth is that what we're seeing here is the emergence of nationalism and Western colonialism as the main roots for the conflict. Zionism is one form of nationalism.
Right.
But Palestinian nationalism and Pan-Arabism are other forms of nationalism. And before that, you had a different form of political control, which was imperialism, which was Ottoman imperialism, where people, shared the place, but also you had first-rate citizens, second-rate citizens, third-rate citizens, so on and so forth. The Arabs were lesser citizens than the Ottomans, and Jews were lesser citizens than Arabs. So what you have is you have nationalism completely, and colonialism, Western colonialism, completely changing the region. Zionism being one of the symptoms of that change. But what you're doing, what a lot of people do, is they take Zionism on its own and isolate it as the one thing that changed the region, and it didn't. There's a lot of wars and conflicts in the Middle East, nationalist conflicts, religious conflicts, have nothing to do with Zionism, because the clashes that emerged in that post-Ottoman Empire world, when Zionism and colonialism created all these new borders and new problems, have not been solved. Zionism is just one of those many problems. And that's why a lot of Jews feel like anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, because it's true that Zionism has all these problems. It's true that Zionism caused all these problems, but that's what nationalist movements do. And the fact that there's so much attention on Jewish nationalism instead of nationalism more generally feels like singling out the Jews. Nationalism is very problematic. When you start seeing yourself and your group as better than everyone else, it's incredibly problematic. But one of the major reasons that Jews did that is because when they didn't do that, when they didn't have Zionism, when they didn't see themselves as the main cause that they needed to defend, they experienced horrific atrocities. And we see in the Middle East that nations that don't have strong nationalism, that don't have that strong instinct of defending themselves, end up experiencing horrible things. If we're talking about the Yazidis, or if we're talking about the Druze, or we're talking about now the Alawites have lost their state, and look what's happening to them, the Kurds, the Palestinians, they were unable to develop their own state. So if Jews didn't have Zionism, they would just be playthings for other groups. If they didn't have the state, they would just be victims instead of being perpetrators. And that's the deeper problem. In the Middle East, if you're not a victim, you're a perpetrator. If you're not a perpetrator, you're a victim. And it's not really about Zionism. It's about much deeper, unsolved social and political issues.
Yeah, I don't think that Jews are singled out with the nationalism issue at all. I think that there's, when you look at like the Kurdish attempts at nationalism, I mean, we're funding wars against the Kurds in order to help them, in order to help limit their nationalist aspirations. I mean, you've got the Ukrainian nationalists, you've got in China, right? You had the Uyghur nationalists that rose up and wanted to have what do they want to call it, Turkmenistan or something like that. I mean, you've got plenty of different nationalist groups that rise up, and big governments and people fund wars against them. I mean, there's no big government funding and waging a war against the Zionist nationalists. I actually think they're getting off way easier than a lot of these other nationalist groups that literally have major militaries fighting against them and bombing them. I mean, Palestine is one, but I think the biggest difference, there's nothing, I don't think even nationalism in and of itself is inherently bad. A lot of us here in the United States would call ourselves American nationalists, right? We believe in the nation of the United States. We want to keep America intact. And that is what we would absolutely defend and fight for. We'd fight for our nationalist movement of America, America the Beautiful. But if another group came in, like the New Shanghai Group, and they decided that they had a nationalist movement and they came in, I wouldn't call it, Shael, a clash between two nationalists and just say, well, it's just a clash between two nationalist groups. I would say, yes, it is. Technically, that is what it is. But one side of the nationalist group, the United States nationalists, would say, no, we were totally and completely in the right to defend what is already our home, which is already our land, already we're here. And this new group has come in, and this new group is saying they want to do something new with the place, and we're not down for that. So I think that's where I don't think we could just call it a clash between two nationalist groups when we know for a fact that most of the Jews that came in were immigrating in. I mean, whether they immigrated in from other Middle Eastern countries or they immigrated in from the Eastern Europe or wherever, they were still immigrating in, the vast majority. And that is not what was exactly happening with the Arabs. I mean, the Arab population grew. They had a lot of babies, but that happens, right? The world is many times more in population just because of birth rates. But I wouldn't call it a two nationalist group. I wouldn't chalk it up to something that simple. Like, well, it was just two different movements that kind of like Republicans and Democrats in the United States, just two different political groups that, came from the same group of people and they just started squabbling. And, one side hated Trump and one side didn't. It's not, I don't think it's like that. I mean, we had a group of immigrants coming in. That's what happened to Palestine. It was a giant group of immigrants that flooded into the zone from all over.
Well, between the two examples you brought, the one that is more of a immigrant nation is the United States. Because
sure.
the people who came to the United States had no ties whatsoever with the United States.
But we tell the immigrants when they come in, you have to become an American. We don't say you get to start a new Shanghai movement or a new Latin America movement. I mean, they don't get to do that.
The reason they don't get to do that is because the United States is strong. It's a question of strength. If you look at it in terms of morality, if you had Latinos in the South say that they want to restore their culture there, like we talked about before, or if you had African Americans say, after the way that we've been treated by the United States government, we deserve our own independence, they would have a very good case. The only thing that's keeping that from happening is not morality, it's America's strength. America's the strongest military power in the world, so that's not happening. Same thing with China. You have China is controlling Tibet and the Uyghurs and so on and so forth. They're too strong, so no one can challenge them. There's no question of morality here. And you're glossing over what I talked about before, which is the Jewish ties to the land, which are real and are historical, and the Jews that existed in the land throughout their history. And it's not just Palestinians having more babies. We also have documented large-scale immigration from Egypt and from Iraq and from Syria into Palestine, and that doesn't make the people who are their children any less Palestinian. I don't believe in primordial nationalism. I believe that nationalism is a social construct. That's consensus in academic circles, and it doesn't really matter if you're of this nation for 12 generations, 8 generations, 3 generations. America's a good example of that. The vast majority of the people here haven't been here for that many generations. Vast majority of the people here came in the late 19th century, early 20th century, something like that. And that's also when the Zionist immigration started.
No, I agree with you on that. I agree that I've never ever supported this idea of like, okay, your ancestors came from Eastern Europe and so you get out. It's not really your homeland. No. I think where you're born, you wake up, you open your eyes, the land you see, the skies you see, the hillside, the plains, whatever it is, that is home to you wherever you're born. It doesn't matter where your parents came from. Where you were born and raised, that is home, and that's that. And nobody should be able to kick you out of that. So I'm a big proponent of the Jews that were born there. That's their home, just like it's anybody else's home. And there is no one has the right to say to them, that is not your home because your ancestors came from somewhere else.
Vast majority of Israelis were born there. Vast majority of Israelis, their parents were born there.
Yeah.
Good portion of their grandparents were born there. And throughout the history of Palestine, there have always been Jews, and they've always been a majority in certain parts of the country. And dismissing Jews' heritage in the land of Israel as just a bunch of immigrants who came in the 20th century is not true. It's not historically viable, and it makes Jews really dismiss a lot of the claims that come against them because we're not buying that. We don't think that that's true, and historically it isn't true. And then our response to that, unfortunately, very often is to pretend the Palestinians don't exist and they have no rights and everything that they do is made up, and we bring evidence of that. And that all these arguments lead to is attempts to destroy the other. Because
right.
If you say Israel has no legitimacy and they're all a bunch of immigrants who showed up out of nowhere in order to disenfranchise Palestinians, or you say the Palestinians were invented in order to destroy Israel, then that means you have the right to go and try to eradicate them. And that's what both sides are looking for right now. Social media revolving around the conflict seems to be a constant attempt to find why the other side's existence is completely illegitimate and needs to be wiped out. And I find that very disturbing and do what I can to go against that.
Okay, let's talk about what's happening now with Trump in the Middle East. And Trump seems to have bypassed Israel. There was reports all over the weekend saying that Trump was going to recognize a Palestinian state, that he's no longer talking to Netanyahu, that they've had a complete falling out. that Trump and his team has gone around Netanyahu and now making deals with, we saw several things go on that has clearly indicated that Trump's at it with Israel, right? First of all, just doing a deal with the Houthis completely, and the deal saying, go ahead and keep attacking Israel. Just don't attack us. I mean, that was one of the first indicators of, wait a minute. The Israelis thinking, what about us? Trump says, I don't know, take care of yourself. Like, we're just taking care of America now. Trump then doing a deal with, going to Saudi Arabia, talking about doing deals without any sort of condition of you must recognize Israel as a nation in order to do these deals. That's off the table now, it seems. Doesn't matter whether or not they recognize Israel as a nation. There's talks that he's going to recognize Palestine. I have a hard time believing that. There's a lot of movement, kicking out Mike Waltz from the administration and saying this guy, was working for the wrong president, basically. One thing about Trump is he is definitely an egotist. I like that actually about him because, and I like the fact that he's one that likes to be liked, because finally we have a politician in office who cares about what people think of him, what the American people think of him. And for a long time, we've had politicians that didn't care. They just cared about what their donors thought. And, they didn't give a damn about their approval ratings, essentially. But Trump actually listens and cares, and he likes to be liked. And that works in the people's favor because he does things and people like it. He does more of it. I mean, that's a good thing. And being an egotist in this case is good because he's the president of the United States and he's asserting that, and he's ensuring that no one else is going to be undermining that his authority and his position. So he's taking the power back to the presidency, I think, which is a good thing ultimately. But I'm curious, now he's saying that he's going to maybe stop sanctioning Syria, and I guess recognizing them as a state. I mean, there's just a lot of moving parts going on. What do you make of all of this? And Trump's the administration's relationship with Israel. What do you think this means for Israel?
Yeah, so I think that framing it as Trump moving against Israel is kind of a misunderstanding of what's happening, and I'm seeing a lot of that. There's two major things going on. One is that Trump is a very much a pragmatist. And he likes to make deals. We all know that. And in his favor, I don't say a lot of things in his favor, when he discovers that one side is more the problem in reaching a deal, and it goes against his initial assessment, he recognizes that. We saw that happen with Ukraine and Russia. And at first, there was a lot of pressure on Zelensky. When he realized that the pressure on Zelensky was just making Putin more likely to cause problems, he started pressuring Putin as well. And he's getting a lot of that. The same dynamic is occurring with Israel and Hamas. Hamas, of course, is a terrorist organization, and Americans instinctively feel that they're untrustworthy, and they are untrustworthy. And that means that they have a tendency to take the Israeli position. But they learned that in this case, for reasons of political survival and so on and so forth, Netanyahu is actually less likely to want a deal than Hamas. And his people, Witkoff and Adam Bowler, are telling him that, and he's listening to them. So that's one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening is a lot more corrupt. You have the Gulf states. Gulf states have incredible sway on Trump, and they realize that they can openly bribe Trump. They don't have to go behind closed doors. They don't have to do anything secret. They can just do it openly. Say, you can have your towers here, and you can have a plane, and we're going to give you this much investment in the United States, and that much investment in the United States, things that Israel can't even dream of offering. And they're pooling their resources together. Countries that have a lot more ability to give than Israel does. Israel's a rich country, but it doesn't have that kind of liquidity. Pooling their resources together in order to get these results. So those two trends are occurring simultaneously. Now, neither of those are pushing him against Israel as a country, at least not yet. What they are is they're souring him on Netanyahu. Netanyahu is an obstacle to his deal. Netanyahu is an obstacle to these better relations that he's trying to have with the Gulf states. Netanyahu is also a kind of a threat to him. They see each other as kind of rival alpha males. They have that kind of thing. He has a proclivity to dislike Netanyahu. He always feels like Netanyahu is trying to outsmart him and play him for a chump, because it's true, he is. And all those things together have led him to turn on the prime minister. Now, the reason that matters is because I don't think that Netanyahu is going to be prime minister for very long, maybe another year or so. And a new prime minister can easily come in and fix a lot of this. Even Netanyahu can fix a lot of this by bowing down. And I think he's going to bow down, maybe not quite enough. So I think we're seeing a souring on Netanyahu rather than a souring on Israel. And by the way, I think that's true for the Gulf states too. I think the Gulf states view Israel as a potential, if not ally, at least useful partner in a lot of things when it comes to technology and military technology and so on and so forth. But they don't see Netanyahu as someone who they can work with anymore. They see the war in Gaza thing that has to stop for their own internal stability and so on and so forth. So you really have the interests of the United States, the Gulf states, and Israel really aren't that far from each other. Not really. They all share a desire to have Iran be less of a threat. They all share a desire for a more prosperous Middle East. It would be good for Israel too, and most Israelis know it, if the war ended and this horror stopped in Gaza and the hostages were released and all that. It's not good for Netanyahu. And normalization would be good for Israel and good for the Gulf states and good for the United States. So there are a lot of interests that they share. That really hasn't changed. But there's a clear understanding from Trump, and the Gulf states have helped him understand this, Witkoff has helped him understand this, that Netanyahu is a problem. He's a problem that needs to be solved. And what we're going to see now over the next few days is an attempt to solve that problem. And if Netanyahu has to go up against Trump directly, he will lose. And he knows that.
Yeah, Trump's been blindsiding him a few times on some things, just bringing him in, sitting him there on camera and saying, we're going to be meeting with Iran, sidestepping him to do the deal with Hamas in order to get the hostage back. Same thing with sidestepping him to do a deal with the Houthis. I mean, there's a lot of sidestepping there and saying, look, I'm the president of the United States and you're not, and this is what we're doing, and we don't need your permission. And that's something that's been said, I think, actually out loud. We don't need the Israelis' permission in order to do XYZ thing. So it's an interesting shift for an American president, for the administration to take on that. And like you said, it's not necessarily being against Israel. It's not like he's against Israel, but it is certainly a shift in the dynamic, because it's never been this like, yeah, we're not even consulting them. We don't care. We don't need their permission. We're the United States. Like, give us a break. It's taking that power back and saying, no, you're the little brother here, not the other way around, right? And that's it. The relationship at some point seemed to have changed. And I wondered when it did. I'm not really sure when, but it seemed to have changed from the United States being the big brother, Israel being the little brother, to at some point Israel kind of controlling a lot of the foreign policy and the power inside of Washington and acting more like the big brother. And the United States, I mean, we saw it with Joe Biden. He was willing to do whatever Israel wanted. He just said, okay, whatever they want, just give it to him, like as if the United States was the little brother. I mean, the dynamic seemed to have shifted, but the dynamic seems to be shifting back. And that seems to be what Trump is doing.
Well, you're right, but the problem is that it seems like the dynamic is now shifting to towing the line of the Saudi Arabians, the Qataris, and the UAE. I don't see this as a great declaration of American independence. I think the U.S. shouldn't listen to Israel on its foreign policy, and sometimes it has listened too much. But we're starting to see too much influence from other actors. And right now, I'm pretty happy with what Saudi Arabia wants, because I agree with what Saudi Arabia wants. Not on everything, but on most things. Like, deal with Iran. I'm all for it. An end to the war in Gaza. I'm all for it. But I'm concerned. I'm concerned about the precedent of the U.S. Obeying the highest bidder, because the highest bidder in the future could have very malign purposes. So I don't think that Trump is really declaring independence as much as that he's following something that's more in his interests. He's being bought out in the open. And the trouble with that is today you're being bought in a direction that you like as a voter. Tomorrow you're being bought in another direction. I'm seeing pro-Trump, Zionists understanding now that they couldn't trust Trump because he can be bought. They thought he was completely in their pocket. And he wasn't. And he's not in the pocket of the Saudis either. If someone I don't know who could offer more money, but if someone theoretically offered more money than the Saudis, he could be bought in that direction. And horrible things can happen that way. The United States foreign policy appears to be for sale. And at least with Biden, there were some principles behind his policy, very old-fashioned kind of Cold War principles, but principles nonetheless. I think it's frightening that we're having a foreign policy that's for sale, even though right now I totally support what the Saudis want.
Yeah, I don't really view it like that. I actually view it as a realignment of what should have always been, which is the United States' greatest ally in the Middle East is actually Saudi Arabia. And that is totally and completely true. And we have ignored that. We've made claims that Israel was our greatest ally, which is total and complete bullshit. What has Israel ever done for the United States? Saudi Arabia has been propping up the U.S. dollar for decades with the petrodollar. I mean, Saudi Arabia has been 1,000% our greatest ally in the Middle East. And if it weren't for Saudi Arabia, the U.S. dollar wouldn't be strong. We wouldn't have had all the oil that we needed. I mean, there was a lot there that Saudi Arabia has been our greatest ally. But we've just kind of bought this phrase of Israel's our greatest ally, Israel's our greatest ally, and that's just not true at all. I mean, it's always been, and it has always been Saudi Arabia. And now I think Trump. I don't think that this is Trump can be bought so much as I think Trump realizes reality, and his reality was, prior to him coming into office, there was a lot of demonizing of Saudi Arabia. There was a lot of, especially after the Jamal Khashoggi issue, murder. There was a lot of demonizing of Saudi Arabia. And I think Trump went in and said, wait a minute, why are we doing that? I mean, that is literally our greatest ally in the Middle East. And that is the one that we have to keep happy. It's Saudi Arabia. And I think he knows that because I think he's pragmatic on that. He's a businessman. He sees the numbers. He sees who's really buttering our bread. And if there is a partner, it's the Saudis. So I actually think he's doing the right thing and being smart and finally realigning our true actual ally and partnership in the Middle East, which has been Saudi Arabia all along.
Well, that's a fundamental difference we have on American foreign policy. I see America's mission globally as the encouragement of democracy, not necessarily through invasion or all that. Like the neocon approach was taking that to a psychotic level, but rather to lead by example through democracy, to defend democracies from invasion and defend human rights globally, so on and so forth. If you're doing that, then Saudi Arabia is not necessarily a natural ally as much as an ally of convenience. And Israel, traditionally, not so much right now, had a lot of liberal elements and a lot of closeness culturally and so on and so forth, right? So if we follow the logic of whoever does the most for you economically and so on and so forth, you wouldn't necessarily support Ukraine against Russia. You wouldn't necessarily support Britain against Nazi Germany. The American role has traditionally been to support democracies when they're under attack, and that's how I see American foreign policy. To me, what's happening now is the United States is moving away from defending liberal democracy at home. It's moving away from liberal democratic principles, and it's moving away from supporting its liberal democratic allies. Israel is not necessarily the most stark example of that, because it's hard for me to talk about Israel right now as some kind of great beacon of liberal democracy. But it's still part of that same trend, where we really see that as the EU.
Sure.
The way that J.D. Vance in particular talks about the EU as if they're the real enemies of the United States is a turning away from that role. So we have a very deep disagreement on what the American role in the world should be. I do believe in American exceptionalism, and I believe that American exceptionalism has to do with its values, with the Constitution, with democracy, and I believe that has a place, not an exclusive place, but has an important place in shaping the interests of the United States globally as well. And Saudi Arabia is not a partner in that enterprise. It's a partner in other things that you mentioned, like the oil market and all that. But I don't think we should be so quick to dismiss what's made the United States different from Russia and China and other countries, which is our commitment to liberal democracy at home and abroad.
Yeah, but that spreading of trying to spread democracy has led to a lot. It's an excuse. It's not real. I mean, we've never been really trying to spread liberal democracy. We've just used it as an excuse to wage wars and topple governments. And yeah, I mean, that's what we use it for. We're not actually doing it, for the goodness of our hearts, because we actually want to free people around the world. I mean, that's what the narrative that we said to people in order to get them to go along with the wars, but that's never been the real motivation for any of them. I mean, it's just a farce. I agree with you, though, that American values, we as a country should want to promote our values and show people around the world how great it is to have these values, right? To have democracy, to have freedom of speech, to have all of these great things. We would want to promote that. But promoting that to me is very different than having, than to say these are our allies and these are. But I hear what you're saying. It's interesting. I mean, I've wondered, how is Israel our greatest ally? And I guess you've laid it out. The concept of them being an ally is based on, because they're a democracy in the middle, supposed, right? Yeah, obviously they're committing a genocide and there's all these other things going on. But, just from the basic, I guess they have elections. But Netanyahu's been in power for a really long time. He might as well be king. I don't understand how he's able to be in power for decades on end, essentially, when we don't have a system that's very different than our system. Can't do that here, right? So I'm not really sure what kind of democracy Israel is, but I get the concept, I suppose.
The truth is, even now, when Israel is such a flawed democracy, there's a lot of similarities. We're actually flawed in a very similar way. Israel has a lot of the same kind of racism that the United States has. Israel has a lot of the same kind of populism in an erosion of democratic values and liberal values that the United States has.
Sure.
In very similar social media narratives and so on and so forth. The truth is, even now, in a very unflattering way, Israel and the United States are very similar. And we understand each other and have a lot of similarities. And that if you know international relations theory, there's different ways of looking at what an alliance means. Some look at an alliance the way you do, which is very bottom line, dollars and cents, tanks and bombs. And others look at it as a meeting of shared values. Mm-hmm. And empirically speaking, in terms of the lessons of history and so on and so forth, there's been more of alliances that have some shared values, or at least there's been more of those that last throughout the ages. Look at NATO, that's still around today, versus a lot of other shifting alliances, like the ones the Soviet Union and the United States had during World War II, when you don't have those principles, or at least a shared sense of identity in some way, the alliances don't last.
Yeah.
And keep in mind also that you're looking, again, very empirically at what it means to have shared values. Is it really a shared value, or is it not? And those of us who believe that identity is socially constructed, we believe that it doesn't really matter if the values are shared, really, as much as do you believe that they're shared. So if Americans look at Israel as their best ally for long enough and identify with Israel for long enough, it becomes reality. And there's a lot of other things like the Bible, the religious heritage, the fact that you have so many cities in the United States that are named after biblical cities in Israel, and you have people read the Old Testament in churches. There's a familiarity. A lot of it's based on an illusion, but illusions are sometimes stronger than reality. So the alliance is based on identity just as much as it is on interest and just as much as it is on shared values. And of course, one of the reasons that's changing, one of the reasons that we have less people, especially young people, who believe in the alliance with Israel is because they don't believe in the values that were the underpinning of that alliance. So if you don't believe in the Bible, and you don't believe that America is a great democracy, then you also might not believe that Israel is a great democracy. And then what makes the relationship between Israel and the United States special, quote unquote, that identity, if you don't believe in that identity, the alliance means nothing to you. So you have to believe America is a great democracy, and you have to believe in the Bible, or at least have it has some significance for you in order to fully buy into the U.S.-Israel alliance as it stood for decades. And young people don't share either of those principles. And that's why I think the U.S.-Israel alliance is on its way to the dustbin.
Yeah.
Because those shared values are gone. And it's a complete illusion. The shared values are a complete illusion. Not that they don't necessarily exist on some level, but it's more about your perception. And that perception is going. So alliances are a lot more complicated than what you're pointing out. The practical element is just one part of it.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think whoever you're doing business with, I think is, and that's true in the business world. I mean, whoever your biggest client is, that's your biggest ally, and you try to make them happy. I mean, that's true in every other aspect of our lives, and I think it should be true when running the country as well, and dealing with, making claims on who our biggest allies are. I think we have to be more upfront and transparent about that. But I see what you're saying, and certainly a lot of people agree about, well, it's more about values than it is about monetary deals and who we're doing business with. But Shael, it's always a great conversation with you. I love that we disagree so much, but we're able to have a great civil conversation. And I think more people need to have these types of conversations where we can disagree and still keep going and talking about different things. And you're always coming back on the show, and even though you're always disagreeing with me, and I think that's just really great. And I think we need to have more of this type of dialogue in today's world, because we just don't have enough of it. So I appreciate you being here.
Yeah. It's always great. You're very civil, and you make great points all the time. I find myself having difficulty rebutting, especially today. You were you made some great points. So
thank you. You do always as well. Shael, I do have your link down below for your Substack, also to your YouTube channel and to your X for people to follow you. How often are you doing your YouTube show?
Nowadays I'm doing it a lot, like 3-4 times a week.
Okay. And then how often are you writing on Substack?
Twice a week.
Okay. And then you're on X every day, because we all are, because we're all addicted. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen Show, which you can catch Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. We do live stream it every day. It's a 1-hour show. You can catch it. It is totally free. Just go to KimIversonShow.com. See you there.